All right, welcome to the review video for Ezekiel class. This is the midterm review, and so I want to first start by going through the test, what kind of questions are on there, and then we'll talk about specifics. Of course, this is a lot of different questions. I'm going to do my best to cover all the material on here. Obviously, you were responsible for anything that I said in class, though, of course, even if I don't mention it in this review video. The first section of the test is a multiple choice section. And so the right answer will be there. You just got to figure out which one it is. The next section is a matching section. And this is matching basically different things about cherubim and seraphim. I have also added the section neither or both. And so there may be things in there that neither apply to cherubim or seraphim, or they might apply to both. And so you'll want to make sure you pay attention to those things. The next section is a true and false section. And be very careful that you read it carefully. Just because maybe I asked the question as a true and false question on a quiz before, I may have changed it. And so you'll want to make sure you read very carefully on that. The next section is a short answer section. That is a full page of short answer. And so make sure that you are prepared for that. There is another multiple choice section. In at least one of the questions, you'll have to circle two different answers, and so read the question very carefully. Then there is a section that deals with some things that you learn from your reading of your textbook. And so think about some of the stuff on that reading assignment, the reading assignments that you had. There are a couple of questions from that. Then there is one essay question. It is worth 9 points, all right? So think about some of the things that maybe we kind of covered in class and spend a little time detailing, and hopefully you will do well on that. The essay question is based on the completeness of your answer, and so if you just write just a little segment of it, all right, it might only be worth a couple of points, all right? If you give a complete answer, it's worth 9 points. I did add 3 bonus questions on here as well, and so hopefully that will help you and be a blessing to you, all right? All right, here we go for our review. By the way, there are 70 normal questions plus the essay question, so that gives you an idea of how big the test is, all right? We mentioned, first of all, that Ezekiel was trained as a priest, and of course we mentioned that there were 3 different captivities that took place during the time that Israel was taken captive. The first captivity was under Jehoiakim, and that was when Daniel was taken captive. Of course, him and all the upper class, and Daniel was the prophet really to the upper class, they were taken to Babylon during that first captivity. The second captivity was under King Jehoiachin, and that was in 597 BC. This was when Ezekiel was taken captive, and of course this was the working class that was taken captive. The third group were the very poorest of the land, and they were left in Jerusalem really until the destruction of the city. And that was under King Zedekiah. Of course, you remember Zedekiah was the last king of Israel, and he tried to escape. And of course, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, caught him and killed his sons in front of his eyes, and then poked his eyes out and took him captive to Babylon. We really mentioned there are 5 main kings towards the end of Israel. Of course, good old King Josiah, who was killed in a battle against Pharaoh Necho. And then we mentioned King Jehoiahaz. He reigned for 3 months and rebelled against the king of Egypt, who he was a vassal king for. The king of Egypt came down and took him captive. So Jehoiahaz reigned for 3 months, was taken captive by the king Pharaoh, and then Jehoiakim was put in his place. Of course, Jehoiakim rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came down. Initially took him over in the 3rd year of his reign, but because he wasn't the king at the time, he was only the general. His dad died. King Nebuchadnezzar had to quickly go back to Babylon to become the king, and so Jehoiakim kind of was left as his vassal king. And then in the 11th year of Jehoiakim's reign, he rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar came and took him captive. He put his son Jehoiachin in his place, and of course we mentioned that Jehoiachin, after 3 months of reigning, became rebelled against the king of Babylon, and Jehoiachin was then taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. The final king, of course, was Zedekiah. He reigned for 11 years and then once again rebelled against Babylon. And that's what we mentioned already, that his eyes were put out and he was taken captive. And so we mentioned those last 4 kings. Jehoiahaz reigned 3 months. Jehoiakim reigned 11 years. Jehoiachin reigned 3 months. And Zedekiah reigned 11 years. And that's a quick, easy way to remember that. We mentioned the fact that Jeremiah was the prophet to those people that were left in Jerusalem. And he was the prophet really to Zedekiah, who was left in Jerusalem as well. And so we mentioned that Jeremiah and Daniel were both contemporary prophets to the prophet Ezekiel. We mentioned that Ezekiel prophesied against false prophets who were preaching that the city would not be destroyed, the temple would not be destroyed. And of course, that wasn't true. We mentioned the fact that Ezekiel's name means strength of God or strengthened by God. And of course, he was strengthened by God. The very first vision that he got was of the throne room of God. And we mentioned the fact that there were 4 cherubim. They were called cherubim in Ezekiel chapter 10. We mentioned they had feet like a calf's foot. They had 4 faces: the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. And of course, we mentioned those kind of align up to different characteristics of Jesus Christ, also different characteristics of the Gospels. We mentioned, obviously, the lion represents the kingship, the kingliness of Christ. We mentioned the ox, the servant in Christ. We mentioned the man, of course. Jesus was the Son of Man, the humanity of Christ. And we mentioned the eagle, of course, divine, the divinity of Christ. We also mentioned the fact that the cherubim had 4 wings. 2 covered the front and 2 covered the sides. We mentioned the fact that they had their wings were very loud, like a waterfall, like God's voice, and like a charging army. We also mentioned the cherubim had balls of fire or a fire that went up and down among them, and lightning shot out of that fire. They also ran and returned as a flash of fire, and each of them had a wheel full of eyes. Of course, we mentioned the fact that cherubim had eyeballs all over them. Their wheels had eyeballs all over them. The seraphim as well had eyeballs all over them. So really, they were very creepy creatures, all right? We mentioned the fact that the cherubim in Solomon's temple, if they were life-size, they were 15 foot tall with a 15-foot wingspan. We mentioned the fact that the cherubim are defenders of God's holiness. Of course, they are the ones pictured as being over the mercy seat. They are also the ones that God chose to protect the Garden of Eden after man was thrown out. And we mentioned the fact that Satan was a cherubim. And it calls him that in the book of Ezekiel. Of course, there is another group called seraphim. And their name means burning ones. Really, the difference between them, they have 6 wings instead of 4 wings. They also fly around the throne and they cry out, "Holy, holy, holy." And so we mentioned the fact that the seraphim do that. Both the cherubim and the seraphim are represented in the Bible as giving coals of fire to different people. Of course, the cherubim gave it to the man with the inkhorn as he went to mark the city. We also mentioned that in Isaiah chapter 6, the seraphim took a coal of fire off the altar and purified his mouth. And so that is something that they both did. We mentioned the fact that really those are 2 classes of angel. Of course, Michael is an archangel. He's not mentioned as either cherubim or seraphim. He is in his own class. He is the only one listed as an archangel. And the Bible doesn't tell us what Gabriel was. As far as we know, he's a regular messenger angel, all right? We mentioned the fact that there is a rainbow that goes around the throne room of God, and there is one sitting on the throne like a human likeness, and Ezekiel called it the glory of God. We mentioned the fact that Ezekiel was called to a certain kind of people. God described them as rebellious, impudent, and stiff-hearted. He was told to preach to these people whether they would hear or whether they would forbear. And he was also told not to worry about their words, their stinging response, or their looks. And so he was to preach no matter what. God gave him a vision in which his message was likened to a scroll, and he was told to eat the scroll. The idea being to fully digest the message that God gave him. And of course, we mentioned the fact that in Ezekiel's mouth it was sweet as honey. And of course, John the Apostle mentioned that it was bitter in the stomach. We also mentioned that Ezekiel sat where they sat. And we talked about the fact that it's important for the preacher to sit where the people sit, to see it from their point of view, to get a heart for the people as well. The Bible said that God called Ezekiel to be a watchman, and with that he was supposed to warn the wicked, and he was supposed to warn the righteous. And of course we mentioned the tragedy of a righteous person who turns to wickedness. The Bible says their righteousness will not be remembered. God also used Ezekiel in many different silent sermons. Of course, we talked about the city under siege, and where Ezekiel made a tile that portrayed Jerusalem on it. And of course, he was to lay siege against that tile. He was also commanded to lie in his side 390 days for the iniquity of Israel and 40 days for the iniquity of Judah. During that time, he was to eat defiled bread and drink only a little bit of water. And we mentioned the fact that it was only enough food and water just to barely keep him alive. We also talked about the fact that there were people under siege. God used him in a silent sermon where he cut off his hair and divided it into 3 parts. And it mentioned the 3 different ways that people would die when the city was taken. Of course, we mentioned they would die by famine, by pestilence, and by the sword. We also mentioned the fact that he was to take a little bit of the hair, tuck it in his belt, and that was to represent the remnant that God would rescue and save during that time. All right. We also mentioned the vision which he had, in which God took him to Jerusalem, and more specifically to the temple. We mentioned the image of jealousy that God talked about, and of course that was located out in the courtyard, right outside of the temple, right next to the altar. And God says that this is an image of jealousy, an abomination. We also mentioned the fact that God took him to an inner chamber, a secret chamber. And we mentioned that he saw all different types of creeping beasts and idols portrayed around there. And of course, we mentioned the fact that that secret place wasn't per se an actual place in the temple, but it represented the imagination or the mind of the people and the priests. They had a lot of wicked things going on in their imagination. Then we mentioned the fact that the Lord took him outside the temple, and he saw 25 men with their backs towards the temple, and they were worshiping the sun. There was also women that were weeping for Tammuz. Tammuz, of course, being the Babylonian god. And of course, we mentioned the fact that he was kind of a counterfeit of Jesus Christ. The Babylonians believed that during the winter and fall, Tammuz died, and then during the spring and summer, he resurrected. And of course, they claimed that Tammuz was a resurrected god. All right. We mentioned the fact that after he saw that vision, he also saw a vision where 6 angels were told to destroy the city. And with that, there was one man that had an inkhorn, and he was told to mark the people that cried out against the abominations. And they were to be rescued. They were not to be killed. And we talked about the fact that God always protects the righteous from the wicked before he judges. We mentioned the fact that a cherubim was recorded as giving the recorder coals of fire in which he would dump out on the city during that time. And we mentioned the fact that Ezekiel watched as the glory of God departed from the temple. And of course, we talked about the fact that it kind of came out of the Holy of Holies, stopped on the threshold of the temple, and then went across the courtyard, and it departed out of the eastern gate. When it went outside the city, it stopped on the Mount of Olives before leaving the area. And of course, we mentioned the fact that the eastern gate is also where the glory of God will return someday to the temple. And of course, the Mount of Olives is where Jesus Christ will return during the second coming. We also talked about the prophecy of the cauldron and the flesh. Of course, the cauldron was the city of Jerusalem. The flesh were the people, and they thought we're a good stew with good pieces of meat. And God says, "You are the meat, but I'm gonna bring the Babylonians in to eat you up." We mentioned the fact that God promised the remnant that was to be saved out of the city, that He would be a little sanctuary to them as well. Then we talked about the captivity of the people. Of course, Ezekiel was told to dig through his house and dig up into the street. Kind of an odd sight. He was also told to eat his bread and drink his water with quaking and fear to represent how the people would be eating their food during the siege of the city. We mentioned the proverb, the days are prolonged and every vision faileth. Of course, that was something that the people would say. That was a proverb of the people. Basically, they were saying Ezekiel's prophecies, they're going to fail. The days are prolonged. Everything's going to be okay. And of course, Ezekiel prophesied against that proverb. We mentioned the fact that God called the messages of the false prophets like a very poorly built wall that would collapse. We also mentioned that there were lady prophetesses that got involved. And of course, they made those magic charms, those amulets that they would sew to the armholes of the people, kind of a little bit of witchcraft. We mentioned the fact that the false prophecies had a devastating effect. It made the heart of the righteous very sad. It strengthened the hands of the wicked, and it kept the wicked from repenting. We mentioned that oftentimes the elders of Israel would come and sit and watch Ezekiel, and they would even inquire from God of Ezekiel. And God told Ezekiel when those elders came to sit and inquire of him, He says that those elders had idols in their heart. And we mentioned the fact that God hates the sin of hypocrisy. The idea that they would want to hear from God, but they didn't really want to hear from God. They had idols in their heart. We mentioned the fact that God told Ezekiel that the city would be destroyed, even if 3 righteous men were in the city. And those righteous men were Noah, Daniel, and Job. God says, even if those 3 men were in the city, I would still destroy the city. I would save their lives, but I would destroy the city. Of course, we mentioned Daniel. That was kind of a special nod to Daniel, because Daniel was the only one of those 3 that was still alive. And he was a contemporary, of course, of Ezekiel. And so it really shows what kind of righteous man Daniel was, that even while he was alive, God declared him one of the most righteous men that ever lived. We also talked about the fact that when God judges wickedness, He does remove the righteous. He protects the righteous from judgment. Then we talked about the prophecy of the useless vine. And of course, God illustrated Israel as a grapevine. And we said, what is a grapevine good for? Except for fruit. The wood can't be used for anything else. Really, a vine has no other use except for its fruitfulness. Then we talked about the longest chapter in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 16. And we mentioned that was a very kind of very harsh chapter, had a lot of very, very strong language in it. We mentioned the fact that Israel was picked as God's chosen people, not because they were great, but because they were weak. In that chapter, God related Israel and Judah to prostitutes, to whores. And He mentioned that they were so wicked that the Philistines would have been ashamed to do the things that Israel and Judah did. We also mentioned that God likened Israel's lovers to the people that they seem to lean towards. We mentioned 3 of them that God mentioned: Egypt, Assyria, and the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians. We also mentioned that Judah was likened as even more wicked than Israel. And of course, God talked about Judah's sisters, Sodom and Samaria. And He says, you're more wicked than them. Sodom's sins, of course, was pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness. And yet God said, Judah's even worse than Sodom. Judah's even worse than Israel. And of course, we mentioned the fact that Judah was worse. They sinned longer. Of course, they became captives of Babylon 130 years after Israel became captives of Assyria. Judah also had more light. They had the temple there. They had the priests there. They also had better kings, and yet they still didn't follow God. They also saw the example of Israel, how Israel had been taken captive, and yet they still did wickedness. We talked about the riddle of the two eagles and the vine. Of course, the first eagle was said to pull up the vine. We mentioned the fact that the first eagle was Babylon, who took King Jehoiachin and his princes captive. And the second eagle was Egypt, and the vine kind of reached out to Egypt to help. And of course, God says Egypt is not going to be any help to you. We mentioned in this prophecy that Messiah was mentioned as a tender branch that would be planted. Then we talked about Ezekiel chapter 18, the individual responsibility of a people. Of course, the proverb was, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. We mentioned the fact that this proverb was a proverb by the people, and they tried to claim that God was unfair, that God didn't punish their fathers like he should have, that they were unfairly being punished for their sin. And it was really an attempt to try to twist Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 6, where God said, I'll punish the generation from the third and fourth generation. And of course, God confronted that proverb and said, no, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. And so people weren't going to be punished for other people's sin. God says, I will punish you for your own sin. Then we talked about Ezekiel chapter 19, and that was kind of the last passage that we dealt with. We mentioned the fact that it's kind of a different passage in that it was a poetical or a musical arrangement. It had a certain arrangement to it, and it was thought to be a funeral dirge or a funeral song, and that was the way it was written. Of course, talking about two lions, young lions, of course, one being Jehoiahaz, who was carried off captive, and then the other one being Jehoiachin. Both of those kings, once again, only reigned for 3 months. They were both young kings. Jehoiahaz was carried away by the king of Egypt. Jehoiachin carried away by the king of Babylon. And God was really likening their funeral to that. All right, there's plenty of things in the reading, of course, that you want to know about. Of course, you want to know, obviously, you probably should know the different years that those last kings, I mentioned 311. Make sure you know those dates. Of course, the date 597 when Ezekiel went into captivity. You want to know which kings took them into captivity. I can't go through everything in the reading assignments. You'll definitely want to look over it. But we mentioned the fact that there's been over 15,000 wars fought over history during this time. We mentioned the fact that the city of Jerusalem was portrayed as a tile. We mentioned, I like the quote there, I can't find it now, by John Wesley, that said, when God created the world, he didn't half try. We mentioned, I'm just trying to scout through here, see any other ones that I think are important. Of course, that statement mentioned several times in Ezekiel, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So there's plenty of things there in the reading you'll want to look over for sure. Once again, 70 questions, 1 essay, a few bonuses as well. And so hopefully you'll study hard and do well on this test.